Hi there, I'm Sarah of So Patterns and So Live, and today we're going to be making your very own pocket bucket that was a part of the Chicken Boots line. The pocket bucket stands upright if you choose to use a stiffener, and it can be made with vinyl pockets or fabric pockets. It's your choice. In the video we're going to be doing the vinyl version. The pockets can be configured to have a triple pocket on one side, a double pocket on the other, and end pockets on either end. The compartment has ample space for a project. The webbing handle is short but can be looped over the arm so you can carry your pocket bucket wherever you go. So I hope you're ready for some heavy-duty sewing and you're ready to make your very own pocket bucket. You're going to need outer fabric, lining fabric, and stiffener if you choose to use it for each of the pattern pieces. You'll need one of each for the bottom, two of each for the front and back, and we'll just call that front back as we go, and two of each for the ends. You'll also need pockets. You'll need two end pockets. These are the vinyl version, and if you use the fabric, make sure you include the 3/4 inch hem at the top. You need a triple pocket, and don't forget all of your notches, and you need a double pocket. You can use the double pocket and the triple pocket on either front and back, so if you want to make both of them double pockets, cut two double pockets, or both of them triple pockets, same idea. You'll also need 15 inches for a webbing handle. I recommend using something a little bit stiff so that your handle will stand up. Makes it a lot easier to use your bag and put things inside. You'll also need about 3.5 yards of 1 3/8 inch wide binding. If you want to make your own, there is video on the So Live YouTube videos for cutting and sewing and piecing together homemade bias tape. For the tools, I like to have a pair of thread snips, seam ripper, a pair of scissors that I can trim through all the thicknesses, and I also like using a tapered tailor's awl. Not the pointier kind, but the tapered tailor's kind, which is a little bit smoother and duller and doesn't stab the fabric quite so much. So if you only have regular awl, it probably work just fine. I just find it to be really handy, especially when you're dealing with thicknesses and binding. All right, are you ready to go? I'm ready. Let's do it. All right, our first step is to prep all of our pieces and get them ready to assemble into the pocket bucket shape. So we do have a few steps for that, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to layer our bottom pieces, and we're just going to tack them together. So you can put your lining right side out, your stiffener. You're just gonna make a sandwich here. I pieced together my bottom piece so I had enough fabric for this one. Make sure there's no little thread pieces or lint or anything on your stiffener, especially if you have a fabric that you can see through, because it will show up, I promise. All right, so you just want to tack this together. Even if you just do it in a few places around, you're just kind of getting this ready for a later step, and then we can set it aside. All right, so our next step is going to be to finish all of our pocket edges. So we're going to bind the vinyl edges, and then we're going to hem the fabric edges. So for the binding, what I like to do is I start on the wrong side of the vinyl, and maybe your vinyl doesn't have an obvious right and wrong side. That's completely fine. You just want to use the wrong side if there is one. This one has a bit of a texture on it. I also tend to like matte vinyl, and so if there's a shinier side, I'll start on the shinier side. So you're gonna put your binding face down on the wrong side of your binding, and you're gonna sew it 1/4 inch. You don't need to back stitch if you don't want. And we're just going to string these pieces together. Just going to sew all of the binding in one fell swoop. So here's my pocket. Just make sure you don't bind the notched edge. You want to make sure that you're leaving that edge unbound. And if things start slipping off the back of your table, just kind of arrange them so they don't fall. You don't want to be pulling against your needle. All right, last one. like to gently pull my binding just a little bit. All right, now cut your binding. And then I like to cut my pieces apart. It's a little easier to manage them while I do the next step. I leave these two together. All right, so now we're gonna bind these. So put your pieces right side up, and you're gonna turn the binding to the right side. You're gonna fold it just past that first stitch line. On the vinyl, it's really easy to see where you just were. And don't worry if it doesn't look great on the other side, but because we're gonna position this in this way, you're gonna nail it on the first try, I promise. So you just need to make sure you keep your needle to the right of that stitching, that stitch line that you just sewed. Don't iron this one because of the vinyl. If you need to, you can do a little bit of gentle ironing if you really need to. Just make sure you test your vinyl a little bit, or maybe put a press cloth between your iron and the vinyl just to protect it. It is a synthetic and it is more vulnerable to heat. All right, and if you want, you can trim these flush right now, or you can do it later. All right, so there's our two ends. Set those aside. Now we're going to do our triple and our double pocket. So same thing, fold it to the right side, fold just past that first stitch line there. And if you have an awl, this is when it kind of starts getting a little handy. If you're a little nervous about getting close to your presser foot or your needle, the awl can be a really great helping hand. Just like that. You want to maintain that seam allowance edge there, because when it fills up the binding, it looks the best. So don't trim down that edge, just leave it that same width that we sewed it, same seam allowance. It's possible to use whiter binding if you like, as long as you take into account that the seam allowance fills up your binding unless you want it to be floppy. If the seam allowance isn't filling up the binding can get a little floppy. All right, so if you want to trim these edges, go ahead. All right, and set those aside. Now we're going to hem our fabric pockets. Now, if you don't want to have to bind your pockets, you can also hem them as long as you're cutting and sewing them out of fabric, like we have here. So you can take that 3/4 of an inch hem allowance on that pattern piece and just hem it over. And if you have a serger, you can serge the edge and then fold it at 3/4 of an inch and hem it, or you can do a rolled hem. And you're gonna fold it 3/8 and 3/8. You can see the little shape here of the hem allowance at the top of the pockets. You're going to fold it 3/8 and then fold it along that shape. Back stitch if you like, you don't need to. These edges will get caught into our last seams. So you can go around, hem your pockets if you're not binding them. You can make your pockets out of fabric and bind them as well. You just don't really need to hem vinyl. The binding is purely decorative. Make sure you're hemming the edge without the notches. You're going to need those later. So, all right, we have our triple pocket, our double pocket, and our two end pockets ready to go on the pocket bucket. Next, we're going to be sewing the front and the back, and we're going to assemble the lining, the outer, and the stiffener pieces. So you're going to take one of each, your stiffener, your outer fabric, and your lining fabric, and you're going to layer them just like this. So put your stiffener down first, your outer fabric face up against the stiffener, lining up these edges. They should all be the same size. And then you're going to put your lining face down. And we're going to sew along this top. This is the top of all sides are equal, so it doesn't matter which one you pick. Just make sure that you keep your fabric right side up as far as a directional print. And you're going to be sewing this top seam 1/4 inch. Now if the pressure of your presser foot is pretty firm, that you might find that it'll push the lining and the outer fabrics towards you on the stiffener. So either release the pressure or just kind of lift up your presser foot occasionally to kind of release that pressure so everything stays lined up. You'll need that pressure later on when we do some of the last steps. Back stitch on these steps, and now you're going to turn your lining to the inside and you're going to fold along this edge. This is a little harder than it looks. The stiffener is really going to resist you, so just make sure you're finger pressing this and getting it ready, and then we're going to pull this lining back here to line it up to the bottom edge. And we're going to stitch along this edge at about 1/8 of an inch. We're just kind of securing all these layers and keeping our sandwich nice and lined up. I like to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from this seam, and so I kind of pick up my piece, fold it along that top edge, and then I pull the lining underneath there. I'm trying to keep this edge straight. Just like that. When you get to the end, we're going to keep securing all of these layers together, so we're just going to stitch along this edge inside that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So just make sure you're keeping everything lined up. You can go around and go back up, but what I find is when I turn this corner and then go back up, I'll get this kind of action happening. So I like to just flip it over and sew the side from the inside. Just try and keep everything lined up still. You can see this little bump that I always get when I am folding along that edge and top stitching it. Now you can decide if you want to secure this bottom edge or not. I'm going to. It's always helpful to have all these layers nice and secure when we get to assembling the pockets and binding the perimeter. There's a little bit of slack in there. And I've been pressing, picking up my presser foot a lot and setting it down. Now you're going to repeat with the other one. So now you have a front and a back. They're identical. And you're ready to attach the pockets. But first we're going to assemble our ends. Okay, for this step we're going to need the stiffener, the outer and the lining fabrics, and your webbing piece for the ends. So we're going to do kind of the same thing. You're going to need one of each. You're going to need your webbing. You can set aside. And you're going to layer it the same way, but this time we're going to slip the webbing in there. So we're going to put our stiffener down. We're going to put our outer fabric facing up. Just line up all these edges. We're going to put our webbing down, and I know this sounds strange, but we're going to extend the webbing past the top edge here. You can do about 3/4 of an inch, and I'll explain why we do that. Now you're going to put your lining face down, lining up all the fabric edges, and we're going to stitch these 3 sides here, 1/4 of an inch seam, and we're going to pivot on either side of the webbing. So just stick that about 3/4 of an inch above this seam, and try and keep it as straight as possible down the middle of your pocket bucket. You'll have a chance to straighten it out when you get back up here. And I lift my presser foot, release that tension that sometimes the presser foot creates on the fabric so that it all stays lined up. All right, so when I get to the webbing and I'm maintaining my 1/4 inch seam, I pivot. And now I'm going to go right across the webbing. I'll show you close up in just a second. Same thing when you get to the other side of the webbing, pivot and go down. So now you have this sewn right along this top edge here. All right, and make sure you back tack here because this next step might pull apart this seam if you don't back tack there. So now we're going to pull the webbing and turn this right side out. Same thing, you're going to finger press this. It's a little easier because there's 3 sides and the webbing kind of helps you. And now we're going to stitch, same thing that we did on the front and the back. We're going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away, pivoting at the top there. And just try and keep these layers lined up. Make sure you don't get any thread between your stiffener and your fabric layers. Just pull that webbing to make it nice and straight. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go around the perimeter. Just try and keep all this lined up. My outer fabric has this white print on here that's a little bit tacky to my presser foot. You just never know how a fabric will react. All right, so now I'm trying to keep all these layers nice and lined up here. I tend to be a puller. You'll see me do this. And I'm going to do this one from the top down. Alright, and so now we're going to stitch again across this webbing. The reason we left this tail in here is because webbing can be sometimes weaker than you think. And if you're not melting the edges, which I don't usually do just because of the fumes and because of the hard plastic that it creates right there, it can kind of create a scratchy end that can wear a hole in your fabric sometimes. But you really need to secure the webbing. Otherwise, over time, if you had just lined that up and flush with the seam and sewed it, it will pull out, I guarantee it. So you need to double stitch it now. So we're just going to stitch 1/4 of an inch away parallel to that top little section, just like this right here. And clip your thread, flip your threads, and you're going to repeat for the other side. And just make sure when you do the other side you don't twist it. So let's do the same thing. We're going to lay our stiffener down, make sure there's no thread in there or any little lint. Outer fabric facing up. And now you're going to take this one face down and line up the webbing same way you did on the other side. This might want to fall off the end of your table, so try not to let it do that. Just focus on this being about 3/4 of an inch above that nice little short end there. Now lay your lining on there to line it all up. If you want to use clips or pins, go for it. And you're going to do the sewing exactly the same way we just did on the other one. 1/4 inch seam, back stitch, and make sure, see how this wants to go off at an angle? Make sure you keep this straight. I like to straighten it out now, right here, because this is the easiest way. I can see that it's perpendicular to my machine bed, parallel to my table. Make sure you pivot off of the webbing. There you go. And same thing. We're going to pull on the webbing to turn it right side out. And we're going to top stitch along this edge. I like to stick this through the head of my machine like that and get it out of my way. Finger press that edge, and I like to pull all these layers, and we're going to secure it. Now if you have trouble sewing thicknesses, this pattern is going to be a little bit tough on your machine. But one way you could cut down on some of the thicknesses is if you cut the stiffener 1/4 of an inch shorter along this perimeter here on the top edge here, and then slip it in there. So you can sew the outer fabric to the lining fabric, turn it, slip the stiffener in there, and then do this step we're doing now. I feel like it's really good practice though to start getting ready to sew some of that stiffer stuff. Alright, so now I'm just securing the perimeter. I like to go down from the top down on both sides, because otherwise what happens is I get a little like tuck sometimes when I'm sewing up, since this is all secured already and there's no place for that fabric to go. Down here the fabric can release off of the bottom since it's not tethered yet or attached. Alright, and sew across the bottom here. We are going to do this again when we do our pockets. Do your best not to get any tucks. I got a couple little tucks there. We'll try and smooth them out in a little bit. Alright, so now double check that you have these the right way, just like this. It should look just like this with the handle not twisted at all. Alright, and now you're ready to attach your pockets. Alright, so grab your end pockets and keep holding on to these ends here. Whether you're doing fabric or vinyl, a bound hem, or a sewn hem, it doesn't matter. They're all sewn from this here on out the exact same way. So you're going to take one end pocket and you're going to line it up at the bottom here. And just tilt this so this lines up here. So make sure you line up your corner down there. Now let's talk about sewing on vinyl. So I'm about to sew on my machine right onto this vinyl, and my machine's going to be fine with it. It tends to be with this type of vinyl here. That's not always the case, and it's not always the case for me for sure. So you can do something like put a piece of Scotch tape or just a piece of tape on the underside of your presser foot, and what I like to do is really scratch it on there, you know, really get it nice and adhered, and then I take the soft side of a nail file and I kind of file off all the excess that's sticking out so that nothing's sticking to my fabric as I sew. That is one way to kind of get a quick and dirty Teflon style sewing foot for your machine, and it's worked a charm for me several times. You can also usually get a Teflon style foot for sewing tacky fabrics like this. And lastly, you can try tissue paper in between your presser foot and the vinyl or whatever tacky fabric that you're using. You just need to be able to, you know, tear that off later on. It is a little bit of a messy step and it adds a little time to your sewing. But what I usually recommend isn't going to help here, where usually I just say don't come in contact with the vinyl with your machine. Just try and keep fabric at all times touching your presser foot. And we don't really have that option here. We really do need to sew onto the vinyl. So just find a method that works for your machine, and I would practice first because it can be a little bit annoying. And honestly, you really don't need to sew all the way around on these edges, but you're going to need to tack it down pretty good so that it holds its shape and it's not a problem when you go to do the binding step. So I'm going to sew all the way around. I'm staying inside my seam allowance, and when I pivot here, I'm also going to pull this up and line it up with that bottom edge. And then I'm going to do the same thing. And now we've formed the pocket shape just like that. All right, so we're going to do the other one. Now if you wanted to just do a few spots, I would do right up here, I would do the corner, and same on this side. Do this corner here, line it all up, and then do your other top edge. So if you really want to come in contact with the vinyl as little as possible, at least do here and here. That way you have the shape of your pocket. We do have a little bit of gapping here, but hopefully when we go to sew the binding on there, we can just manage that carefully. All right, so now we're going to attach the pockets to the front and the back. So get your front and back out. Get your double, triple pockets, whatever you're using, out. Take one, doesn't matter which one, either one will sew to the front and back. And you're going to do the same thing. You're going to line it up from the bottom up. The reason we don't add notches to the patterns here mainly is because when you have such small seam allowances, it just adds another risk that you might cut into the fabric a little deep and deeper than your seam allowance. So we just get good at lining up from the bottom. It's a production technique. So now we're going to get to the bottom down here. We're going to pivot, and we have this notch right here, and we're going to pleat it away from us, right? So I'm just going to fold this, and I want to just keep that pleat well away from this edge. I want my seam allowance still and room for binding. So maybe leave yourself 3/8 of an inch there. All right, and so now you're just going to keep sewing, and this is the triple pocket, so there's a lot of pleating on this one. So now your next notch here, you're going to pleat toward you, there's 3 notches here, so you're going to pleat this one towards the middle notch. Now if you're doing fabric, it's really easy to stretch your fabric by accident, and your pockets will get a little bit too long for this space, so just make sure you're paying attention to that. All right, so now you've got this pleat going to that middle notch. Don't sew too far. And now you're going to take the next notch and go towards the last pleat. So you're pleating always towards each other. So there we go. So now we're going to sew across the middle pocket down here, and we're getting to our next notch, and we're going to do the exact same thing. Pleat toward the center notch. Don't be shy about it. You don't want your pocket to be too big for this space. Now pleat away from you to that middle notch again. And now we're coming to the end here. This one's a little trickier. I really recommend too that if anything gets down here in your pocket, like threads or anything, get it out now. It's almost impossible to get it out after this step. All right, so same thing. You're going to line up this edge along the raw edge of the pocket, the front and back, and take the pleat, the little notch there, and pleat it toward you. Keep it about 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge. It's always a little fussier when I'm trying to be very cautious. All right, here we go. So we have the fold here coming towards me about 3/8 of an inch away. So there's space right here for my binding and my seam allowance later on. And just stitch this down, and then you're going to pivot again. Make sure you're always staying inside that 1/4 inch seam allowance. I know mine's a little messy here, but that's going to be okay. Keep your raw edges lined up. I haven't trimmed this binding edge here. All right, so now don't forget to do this next step. I have done that several times, got pocket buckets all the way done, and then I couldn't sell them. All right, so now you're going to stitch down the dividers of each of these pockets. So it kind of wants to stay in this nice pleated shape. So it's really easy to forget this step because it looks like it's done already, right? So now you're going to sew straight up in between these pleat folds, straight up the pocket bucket. Now, if you really want to, you could mark this amount, like from here to here, mark it over here so you have a guide. Same with this one, from here to here, up here, have a guide. But I think that with a little bit of caution, you can get this pretty straight. You can see my folds are going a little bit off here. So I'm just going to kind of straighten that out a little bit. What I like to do is press these folds down just like this. And does that look straight to me? It does. Now I'm going to hold this down in the center and go straight up. Now just try not to stitch on the folds of your pleats, especially in the vinyl. The vinyl is very unforgiving when it comes to holes. Just go straight up. The machine wants to sew straight and will pretty much hold your piece straight. And look at that. You can see that this is parallel to my machine, so I know that I got a nice straight edge. It's perpendicular. Now we're going to do the same thing. Now if you nick that little bit right there, don't worry about that. That's going to be in the binding edge. All right, now same thing. I like to pleat it up, just kind of like that. Okay, it looks straight. I look everything on my machine here, on my machine bed, and I push these pleats away and I sew. I'm kind of holding where I think the center is right there. There you go. And now turn it over. Clip your threads while you can see them right now. And check it out. All right, we're going to do the exact same thing with our double pocket. Just make sure also that this is the finished edge of your front and back. It's parallel to the hem of your pocket. All right, so line it up along the bottom here. Sew down. Pivot at that corner. You're going to pleat away from you, 3/8 of an inch away from that edge. And then now this is only the double pocket, so we have a little bit more space through down the middle here. We're going to pleat this one towards that center notch. And then this one away from you towards that center notch. And now we're going to line up this raw edge here. Sometimes what I like to do is I like to fold this and then lay that raw edge down. And sometimes also what I find is that maybe this length of pocket is a little bit bigger than the space I'm trying to fit it in, especially certain fabrics. If there's any type of discrepancy in cutting and sewing, even a 1/16 of an inch, it really adds up really quickly. So what I like to do is, line this up, and then, you can make your pleat wherever you want, honestly. It doesn't really matter as long as you have this space right here. As long as you have about 3/8 of an inch there. It'll be a lot easier to sew later on. All right, then line up that edge. So don't feel like you need to take that all apart if this pleat is marginally bigger than the others or smaller. All right, so now we're going to do the same thing we did before. So you could mark the middle here to know where to go from here to here, or measure from here to here, just in case this pocket got a little smaller, or maybe you're making your pockets in custom widths, because you can do that, whatever you want. Just make sure that you're stitching from the pleat, middle of the pleat, to the exact same spot parallel. Alright, so I like to pleat my pocket like that, find my center there, hold it, press my pleats away, and go for it, because the machine likes to hold it pretty straight. Alright, so now we have our front and our back. We have our ends. We have our bottom too. Remember, we tacked that together a long time ago. And now we're ready to make our pocket bucket into a bucket shape. Are you ready? So now's the time. Make sure you have a nice fresh needle. I would recommend something in the size 16 realm. And make sure that you're just ready to be patient and get this sewn up, because it's going to be fantastic when it's done, I promise. Alright, are you ready to start making this into a bucket? Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to sew our bottom to the front and the back. So take your front and back, and we're going to just trim up these edges here. There's a little bit of fabric hanging off and maybe some threads, and you just really want to clean this up. My stiffener is sticking out a little bit further there, so I'm going to kind of trim a little bit of that off. It'll make it a lot easier later on if we can get these edges kind of trued up. Just make sure you're not trimming them so that your bag isn't going to be square anymore. Alright, so get rid of all this stuff. You don't want it to slip into the pockets. I can't stress that enough. It is really hard to get that stuff out of there later on. Alright, so let's trim up this one here. And the same with your bottom. Make sure that's all trimmed up and ready to go. And if you want to secure any more edges, go for it. Alright, so take one of your front backs and then your bottom, and you're going to put them lining sides together. And from the bottom side, so the bottom is facing up, you're going to sew your binding to this bottom edge of the pockets. Alright, so we're going to sew that 1/4 inch seam. See, now your machine isn't coming into contact with any of the vinyl, so you're safe there. All right, now if you need to trim up this edge a little bit, maybe you didn't get it quite 1/4 inch the whole way, now's the time. You're going to turn this to the right side, turn it under, and put that fold line just past that stitch line. Now we're covering up all of our tacking and basting that we've done already, and this is the time that we're clean finishing this whole edge. Get your awl if you need to. If you got a little close to your vinyl when you sewed up that seam there, try and cover it up with the binding now. The awl can really pull the binding as well. Alright, so now we have one. Here we go. You can trim this little tail off if you like. Oops, I got that a little bit unstraight. Alright, and now we're going to do the exact same thing with the other one. So make sure you're lining up the bottom of the pockets to the bottom pattern piece. Just like that. Line up these edges. You're going to sew 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can open up your bias seams or push them to the side. It doesn't really matter. Just make sure they're nice and flat. When you are attaching your binding, you can tug it a little bit as you're going. So see how mine's lifting up off of the pocket bucket. It'll be a lot easier to turn to the right side when I go to stitch it down. Kind of just wants to naturally go that direction. Alright, so now we're going to stitch this down again. This is warming you up for all that heavy-duty sewing we're about to do. You only have one big step left after this one. It's kind of a two-part step. Alright, here we go. So now we have the bones of our pocket bucket, right? Here we go. So you want to trim these little ends off here. Now check your bobbin, make sure it's full. You don't want to run out on these next steps. Make sure you have enough binding, and you are ready to go. All right, you ready? Let's do it. Okay, moment of truth. Here we go. We are ready to do the last two big steps of our pocket bucket, and we're going to be attaching the ends to this bag assembly that we've created here. And so make sure that your bobbin is full and you have a nice good needle in there. And, you know, double check that you got your ends nice and clean here. There's no fabric slipping out from the lining or the stiffener. You're not seeing anything there. And make sure everything looks good. So now this might feel a little weird to do. I've definitely sewn lots of these, so it's second nature for me. So you're gonna line this up. Just open up your bag here. You're gonna line up your end here at a 1/4 inch seam line. So that doesn't mean don't line these edges up right here, right? You need to slip this down a little bit, and you need it to line up on the 1/4 inch seam allowance right here, so that this juncture is at that seam line. If you line up the raw edges like this, your bag is sticking up above, it will not line up when you get to the bottom. It'll be too short and you'll be in trouble. All right, so make sure you put this lining sides together. I like to start on the end and then wrap around to the other side. If you're comfortable doing it the other way, that's fine. I've tried both, and this is the way I settled on. So I like to start here. Now, one thing you have to remember is to sweep these pockets away from the seam. So when I talk about sweeping the pocket away, check your pocket, you know, smooth it out underneath. That's what I'm talking about, because you don't want this to happen. You don't want this pleated pocket to kind of slip past this edge or even just a little bit and get caught in that seam. And that's why we tried to give ourselves enough of a clearance there when we were putting the pleats in with the pockets. So make sure you do that. The other few tips I like to make sure you know about are always stopping with your needle down. And if you're going to use your machine to sew it without pressing on your foot pedal, you're going to use your hand wheel. Always turn the hand wheel toward you, never away. All right, and you can just walk it stitch by stitch, especially when we get to these heavy-duty corners here. All right, I have lots more tips, so they're just going to come as we go, and you're ready to do this. I also don't recommend pre-sewing the perimeter right now. Like it's very, very tempting. I used to try and do this all the time, to pre-sew it so that it was in the shape and then adding my binding. I don't recommend that because it ends up creating the potential for, if you don't get the binding on there perfectly when you go to do your final couple steps, you may see that stitching kind of sticking out. And if you do that, especially on this vinyl, even if you remove the stitching after the binding is on there, those holes are going to still be there. And so then you're kind of faced with, okay, do I try and make my binding seam allowance a little bigger? And then you're trimming away the extra seam allowance, and your binding gets narrower. It kind of ends up just a domino effect of other issues that you might encounter. So I recommend just kind of taking your time and doing this and sewing the binding on at the same time. Maintain your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Let it know who's boss. You are the boss here. All right. The other thing I like to encourage you to do is smash your bag down. Smash it down. It will not hurt anything. If you've ever ordered one of these from me, it was smashed just like I'm about to do, and it's fine. So those are my tips for now. All right, let's do it. Okay, so we're going to line this up. Raw edges here, 1/4 inch seam line right there. So remember that we want that little juncture right there. And if you've sewn these things like this with me before, you know I like to prettily fold this little edge. Can't do that on this one, but we're going to do it on the last step. So you're just going to hang your binding off about 3/4 of an inch there. At least 3/4, up to an inch if you like. Back stitch for sure. All right, now I've got it in there. I've got my needle down. I'm kind of looking at everything, arranging. I'm smoothing all these threads out of the way. I want as little work at the end as possible. You can feel your bag kind of pushing up from the table, and that's because those pleated pockets are under there, especially if they're in vinyl. So remember, see that little bubble there? I want to smooth all this away. Smooth it away, and then I press my pocket bucket onto the table so that they can't slip back under there. All right, put my binding down. I'm lining it all up. Trust yourself. Trust yourself with the seam allowance. Just make sure that you have all this lined up, all your edges, and then use your 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you want to add a label, now's a good time to do it. Maybe, you know, under, like right here. We always stuck ours right underneath the binding here coming out, but I always forgot to do it. So sometimes we would just put it right here, just sticking straight out from the raw edge. All right, so like I said, we're smoothing the pocket. I like to push my finger here, and I'm literally pushing this away like this, just like this. This is that pleat right there. Don't be too forceful. You don't want to tear your vinyl, but you can really let it know who's boss here. All right, so 1/4 inch seam, we're coming down. And on my machine table, sometimes these bottom seams will get caught on the table. So be really careful. You don't want to pull your hand towards the needle inadvertently. All right, so those seams of the bottom, they're gonna press toward the bottom. So that bound seam there, press it toward the bottom. So this first one is pressing toward you, which is towards the bottom. Making sure our pleats are out of the way, coming up. And now our end is extending past that seam about 1/4 inch. And you're going to stop in that ditch of the seam and pivot. So about 1/4 inch away. So there we are. I'm about 1/4 inch away. I'm going to lower my camera down here. It's going to be in the way of my face so you can see. So here's the seam right here. 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's where my needle is, right about there. And now I'm going to pick this up. And remember, this is attached to this other end here. It may give you a little bit of grief. So just make sure you let it know who's boss. That's you, okay? So you're going to pick this up. I lift up my presser foot. I'm going to pivot this. I'm going to pull this. You see how it's pulling the bag there? I'm going to pull this and line up this raw edge. This is the one that I didn't stitch all the way down. So you can see why it can be a little bit problematic if you're not stitching all the way around. That's okay. We're going to manage that, and the vinyl, the binding's going to be on top of the vinyl. It's going to be fine. All right, so line up all these raw edges. Now, if this is extending a little bit past, that's okay. If that was the 1/4 inch mark, then just stick with that. All right, and so pivot your binding. Keep all this smooth. And if you're walking your hand wheel, just walk it towards you, stitch by stitch. Keep going. All right, you made it, okay? 3 more corners, that's it. So only one on this one, though. All right, so now push this seam away from you now towards the bottom. Those really want to sometimes poke towards you, especially right here when it goes up over the bump of my bed of my machine. So I make sure. Now I'm getting back to front back, so I gotta make sure I do my pocket sweeping again, right? So let's push these pockets away, get it all ready, push the bag down on the table so they can't slip out, and then let's look at here. I'm gonna look at that 1/4 inch seam from here, my pivot point in this ditch right there. Stitch by stitch, and my needle is down, presser foot up, and again I'm gonna pull this bag all the way over here, lining up those raw edges. Now we're gonna start doing the bag smashing, right? Look at that, I'm really smashing this bag. All right, so now kind of give this a little tug. Make sure you don't get a little bump right here like this. You're going to pivot everything here. Sweep your pocket underneath. Fabric pockets are less bulky. They are easier to sew, but they can be a little sneaky. All right, so make sure now put your presser foot down. Keep sewing. If you get a little bit of tucks in your binding here, don't worry about this. This little juncture here, there's a lot going on there. And in the end, when we do our last bit of stitching, it's really all gonna be fine, especially because it's not really a focal point of the bag. All right, so look, I'm smashing the bag here. This is my other end. This is my double pocket side, so you can see I'm really smashing it. Make sure your vinyl pleats are fine, or any of your pleats. Let's get this secure. You see, because I didn't stitch this end down, I can see my vinyl here wants to kind of give me a little bit of a tuck there. I'm actually going to unstitch that little tiny bit I stitched so it can lay flat. The other one won't be a problem since I stitched around the perimeter. All right, so keep going. And now remember, this is okay that we have this juncture like this, right? We want to see this little corner right here that my finger's on. And sometimes I try and pull it and make sure I aim for this juncture right there. It's a little bit misaligned. If you get that a little bit off, it's really not a big deal, I promise. All right, so that's what it's looking like. It looks a little messy, right? That's gonna be okay. Now cut your binding off 3/4 inch above the seam, right? Give yourself a little bit of a tail. All right, and so now you're gonna trim this. It's a little awkward for me to trim this under the camera, but I like to smash it down. I make sure I'm not going to nick my pleat because I can't see it, and I'm gonna trim this down to that 1/4 inch seam allowance. My fingers are underneath holding that pleat out of the way, making sure I can feel it and I know where it's at. All right, and so when I get over here, I actually mash the bag again, rotating it so that I'm only holding these layers here. Now when you trim these corners, just kind of trim them up to that 1/4 inch width. In other words, as a garment sewist, we're taught to kind of cut off the corner, but we're not doing that kind of corner sewing. You really just need to have your 1/4 inch seam width there. So I like to kind of look at this. I used to always accidentally clip that little binding there, so I was trying to make sure that's away, and I just kind of trim it a little bit up. The binding's really stretchy. It's going to allow us to pull it over that big bump there. All right, same with this corner here. Make sure I'm not trimming anything else. Get rid of all this. Make sure it doesn't drop in any of your pockets. Now let's see, how'd you do there? We stayed away from our pleats, that's great. See, I still have a little bit of wiggle room there. Everything's looking really good. All right, so now we're gonna do our other side. We're gonna attach our other end to the other side before we finish our binding. All right, so I know the camera's a little close there. All right, so now you're really gonna start off with your bag smashing, okay? So pull your bag open like this. Just mash it down. Just get this piece here, this front or back, whatever you want to call it, nice and flat to the table. Make sure you don't twist the strap. So you see that? My strap is still flat against itself. Pull your end over here just so that you know you didn't twist it. Definitely done that before too. All right, same thing, line it up, 1/4 inch seam. If you get a juncture of your binding right about here, what I would do is cut that off and start somewhere else. It'll kind of give you a little bit of problem later on. So just make sure you hang your tail off about 3/4 inch. I'm going to do the exact same thing. All right, I get it started, and now like you can see my vinyl pocket is trying to sneak out. Little bugger. All right, so now we're going to push this vinyl. I kind of pick up that pocket, smash it over there. My hands are very strong from sewing this kind of stuff, so I know how fatiguing this can be. You're going to be a little sore tomorrow, but just don't relent. Take breaks, stretch if you need to, and make sure you relax your hands and shake them out a little bit. Maybe don't do all of this in one sitting. All right, so making sure my pocket nice and out of the way. Even the pocket itself may want to kind of pleat up where there's no pleat, in between the pleat and the edge. All right, so same thing. All right, so now we're getting to the end of the end here, and we're gonna hang it off 1/4 inch past this sewn seam. If you're a little shy, just try and get as close as possible. And remember, the seam of the bottom to the front and back is pressed towards you, towards the bottom, which is towards the bottom. All right, so now we're gonna pivot. So pick this up. Look at my bag. It's just all smashed, all kinds of smashed right now, but it's gonna be okay. Pick this end up, pick up your presser foot, leave your needle down. Don't forget to do that, otherwise you're gonna rip it right out of the machine. You're gonna slide it over here. Actually, let's flatten this out a little bit more. We really like the piece we're sewing on to be flat. So now pick this up, slide it over, just like that. All right, rotate your binding, carry on. No pocket on the bottom, which is a nice little break. You don't have to worry about that. Don't let this like fall over either. It can kind of do that. All right, so now here's your seam of your bottom. Push it away from you towards the bottom. Make sure this is hanging off this finished seam here, this raw edge, going a little bit past. You can see I have a little bit of extra fabric here from the lining. Just let that hang off. It's okay. We'll trim it up. All right, so sink your needle down into the corner, pivot the bag, lining up to the other front back. Now arrange everything. My needle is down, presser foot is up. All right, everything is smooth. Presser foot down. If you're walking, just be sure you're walking it toward you. Unless you're doing a back stitch. Okay, so keep that all lined up. I have a little bit of a big seam there, but that'll be okay. I'll show you what that looks like at the end. Now make sure your binding hangs off about 3/4 of an inch. Give yourself a tail just like that. All right, now trim up this edge here. Push your pleats away from the edge there. Don't cut yourself. Keep your binding away from there. This is a lot of thickness right there. You have, let's see, 2 layers of vinyl. 1, 2, 3 layers of outer fabric, 3 layers of lining fabric, the binding here, and the binding we're attaching. It's possibly one of the thickest seams you'll probably ever sew. It is for me. All right, and so look at this. See this pleat right here? Push it away as you trim. And just keep this nice, the seam allowance nice and parallel. Keep your 1/4 inch. Maintain the 1/4 inch. Get all this off your work surface. Don't let it fall into those pockets. I laugh, but I'm telling you, it's a pain. All right, so now we have one major step left. So make sure you shake out your hands, get a drink, make sure your needle's doing good. Inspect everything. Now it's a really good time. Look inside your bag. Make sure all of those edges have been caught, because you can't change it later without a lot of work. So make sure you look in there, see if everything's caught. Pull out any threads if you want. Everything looks good. All right, and so now we're in the serious bag smashing part again. We don't really have to worry about our pleats because we're gonna be able to see them. We will have to worry about this pocket here, but it's a little less finicky. All right, so smash your bag down. Pull your binding to the right side, just like that. And if you don't think you're gonna be able to turn that another 1/4 of an inch when you get to that corner there, trim this up a little bit more. All right, and so make sure it's nice and smooth. You see that? Nice and smooth. Now, you wanna do your best to keep your needle to the right of this stitch line that you just sewed, because you will be stitching on the bag on the other side. If you do, and it's just a little bit, don't worry about it. If you did vinyl pockets, don't take it out, just leave it. You probably won't notice it after a little bit, I can assure you. All right, so let's get going. So we're gonna neatly fold the top here. So this always already wants to kind of fold because it's part of that seam. So fold it in, pull it down, just like that. Now turn down this corner just to the raw edges that are inside there. And now just proceed with folding your binding. Fold, fold. So there you go. Hold that down. Get your awl out if you have it. You can use your seam ripper, but I feel like the seam ripper, you're in danger of cutting your fabric, but if it's the only thing you have, give it a try. All right, so now we're going to back stitch right here. Catch that in there. I like to get my binding tail secure, and then I start arranging. All right, so now I'm going to this other corner here, because I'm sewing on this one right here, and then this one. So I'm gonna pull my binding here, just like that. Line everything up, get the bag smashing going. Needle down if you're arranging, and now put your presser foot down. Here we go. So that fold goes just past the seam we just sewed, and we're stitching to the right of that seam. When you get to the corner, it gets a little trickier to stay in there. All right, so now before I get there, I like to turn this under. Turn it under there. You can even run your awl inside here to make sure. It's okay if it's not covering the seam quite yet, because we're going to be able to pull it over because the bias makes it stretchy. Now be really careful on these corners. They're very, very thick. So if you want to walk your seam, your sewing with your hand wheel just like this, go for it. Now, when you pivot, keep your needle down, pick your presser foot up, and now I put my hand inside the bag. Put my hand inside the bag here, and I'm pushing right here with my other hand is pushing right here while I press down, and then I'm pushing out the sides just like this so I can get this flat as possible. It's not going to go all the way flat, but you know what I mean. All right, so let me pull down the camera a little bit more. Here we go. So I'm picking up my binding with the edge of my awl and making sure that I'm catching it with my needle. All right, and so now I'm getting to this other corner, so I'm going to arrange it. Try and do it before you get there. That way you have a little bit of space. You don't want to do it too early, and you don't want to do it too late. All right, so you can see all my stitching in there, but we're going to cover all that up. Let's make sure we're not letting our pocket slip down on the end. And look at this. I really have this mashed. It's kind of horrifying, isn't it? All right, so here we go. I know you're probably wincing when you go through those corners, so be really careful. Wear some safety goggles if that makes you feel better. All right, and so fold your binding. Grab it with your awl. Press your foot down. When you grab it with your awl, this is what I mean. You're grabbing that little edge and you're pulling it. You can really pull because it's stretchy. Make sure your end pocket on the other side is smooth. All right, and so now we get to this other end here that we need to secure the tail. So same thing, we want this to continue to fold right there. That's part of the original seam. Fold it away from you, fold it down, and then turn this corner down towards the raw edges right there, just like that. And then fold, fold, like we've already been doing. I like to push this little raw edge inside there and pull the binding to cover it all up. And backstitch. Clip your threads. And let's inspect it. I'll clip my other thread. Just like that. And here we go. How'd we do? Not bad. I haven't sewn this in a while, so not too bad. Here we go. And see, everything's fine. Even though it got really smashed, it will recover. All right, we have one more left. How are you doing? Shake it out. Get a drink. We've got this. All right, here we go. Same thing. Arrange your corner. Smash everything down. This tail's a little long. I like it about that long there. Fold it under, fold it toward me, and there's, you know, these are my little thread tails there. They like to sneak out, but sometimes I just tuck them in there. Fold the corner down, fold, fold. And so you can see I don't have it perfectly arranged quite yet. I wait to get it under here, hold it with my awl. It's getting caught on my edge of my table there. So I'm just going to try and get it secure so I can now arrange it. And now I'm going to poke that tail in there a little further. Hold it, pull my binding over so it's all nice and clean. All right, so now push the pleats away. Take that fold just past the stitches and then stitch it down. All right, we're getting close to that corner, so turn it under. You can see my presser foot is up right now. Needle's down, that's why I can kind of swing it around like this. I'm gonna arrange my other corner just like that. See that? And now I'm ready. So I've got my bag smashed. My end pocket is smooth. And I keep going. Pull this binding over that stitch there. Now this looks like it's going to be a problem. It's just not. Don't worry about that. Just stick to your binding. Got my hand in the bag and I'm pushing all of this away. What I like to do is just press the bottom as flat as possible. All right, turn under that edge. Always keep your needle down when you have your presser foot up. And don't forget to put your presser foot back down when you start sewing again. All right, I've got this other corner folded under. All right, so we got our other edge here. Let's make sure that's enough of this is folded under here to go around this corner. Feels a little shallow. All right, so now I can open it up a little bit. And I sometimes like a pull on this edge here to kind of pull it out. And when you're pivoting, I should say, you're pivoting at the seam line. This is the inside when we were pivoting when we first put the binding on, and we could see the inside of the bag there in that seam when we were pivoting at the bottom. This is it right here. So you're not pivoting at the edge of the binding, you're pivoting at the seam of the binding. Now I pivot. So I'm pushing the bottom out, the front back down. Don't catch your pleats in there. You're getting really close to them. Put your binding down. All right, so here we are at the top. Keep that fold going away from you. Turn down the corner, fold, fold. Just sit there and arrange it, you know, like take your time. And tuck that little tail in there. Hide it all in there. So it's nice and clean. Now clip your threads before you inspect. That's the reward. I always clip my threads before. All right, here we go. So you can see it's kind of blumping. Just poke it in there. And we have our very own pocket bucket. You did it. Good job. I'm really pleased to see you made it this far. I know how hard this bag is. It took me years to develop it and get really good at sewing it. So kudos to you. I'm really, really pleased. Thank you so much for sewing the pocket bucket. And if you ever want to join me live, please do so. I'm live on YouTube a few times each week. We'd love to have you. It's a really great group of sewists, and we sew all kinds of stuff. So, and if you have sewn this and you're going to post it to social media, please use the hashtag #SSPocketBucket so I get to see it, because I really want to see it. And you can also use the hashtag #SewPatterns. Thanks so much. I'm Sarah Me, and happy sewing.